It was a chilly evening, and the wind whispered through the trees as Emily pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She had just finished another long day of babysitting, a job she had grown to love despite its challenges. The Johnsons, a sweet couple she often worked for, had recommended her to a single father named Mark, who desperately needed someone to watch his 5-year-old son, Noah. The job was supposed to be just another routine gig. Watch the kid for a few hours, keep him entertained, put him to bed, and go home. Simple, right? But that night, something changed. Mark had shown up at the door, looking exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just a lack of sleep. His clothes were neat, but slightly worn, and his eyes held a weight that Emily had seen before, in people who were struggling, but too proud to admit it. He had introduced himself quickly, thanking her profusely for agreeing to babysit on such short notice. Noah, on the other hand, was full of energy, flashing a wide grin as he clutched his favorite stuffed bear. Throughout the night, Emily noticed little things. The fridge wasn't exactly full, and some of Noah's clothes seemed a bit too small for him. The apartment was clean, but there was an emptiness to it, a lack of warmth, as if life had been squeezing Mark a little too hard lately. Still, she didn't ask questions. She wasn't one to pry. Her job was to take care of Noah, and that's exactly what she did. They played games, read stories, and laughed together until Noah's eyelids grew heavy. As she tucked him into bed, he clung to her hand for a moment longer than most kids did. "Will you come back again?" he asked, his voice sleepy but hopeful. Emily smiled. "Of course, buddy." When Mark returned home later that night, he looked even more drained than before. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills, and extended them toward her. His hand trembled slightly. Whether from exhaustion or something else, she wasn't sure. Emily glanced at the money and then back at him. It wasn't much. In fact, it was barely half of what she usually charged. And in that moment, she knew. She shook her head gently. "It's okay," she said. "You don't have to pay me tonight." Mark blinked, taken aback. "No, please." "I don't want charity," he insisted, his voice tight with embarrassment. "It's not charity," she assured him. "Consider it a favor, a small one." He hesitated, looking like he wanted to argue. But eventually, he sighed and nodded. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with something unspoken. Emily left that night feeling a strange mix of emotions. She had done something kind, something she knew was right, but there was also an uneasiness in her chest. A feeling that this wasn't just another babysitting job. This was something more. Days passed, then a week. She didn't hear from Mark again, and she started to wonder if he felt too ashamed to call her back. Maybe he thought she pitied him. Maybe he had found another babysitter, someone who wouldn't notice the things she did. Then, one evening, just as she was settling in with a book, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Hello," she answered. There was a pause. And then, a familiar voice. "Emily." It was Mark. But something was different. His voice wasn't just tired anymore. It was filled with something else, something she couldn't quite place. "I need to see you," he said, his words coming quickly, almost breathless. "There's something I have to tell you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Is everything okay? Is Noah all right?" "Yes," he assured her. "He's fine. It's just, I need to see you in person." Emily hesitated for only a moment before saying, "Okay." When she arrived at the coffee shop, where they had agreed to meet, she spotted Mark sitting by the window, his hands clasped tightly around a cup of coffee. He looked different, more awake, more alive. There was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before, And then he spoke. The words that came out of his mouth made her freeze. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening as she tried to process what he was saying. She never expected this, not in a million years. And before she knew it, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. Emily sat frozen, staring at Mark, her mind racing to make sense of his words. The way he looked at her, like he had been holding on to something huge, something that had changed everything, made her chest tighten. "I don't even know how to begin," he admitted, rubbing a hand over his face. His fingers trembled slightly, and she noticed that same exhaustion in his eyes. But now there was something else too. "Hope, just tell me," she said gently, though her pulse was hammering in her ears. Mark let out a slow breath. "After that night, when you refused, the money, I wasn't sure how to feel. I was grateful, but I was also embarrassed. I've been struggling, Emily, more than I ever let on." Emily nodded, but she stayed quiet, letting him speak. "You probably noticed things weren't great," he continued. "I lost my job a few months back. I used to work in construction, but when the company started downsizing, I was one of the first to go. Finding work hasn't been easy. I picked up side gigs, anything I could to keep a roof over our heads, but it was barely enough." He paused, his jaw tightening. "That night, I had just come back from an interview. I thought I had a shot, but they turned me down, again, and all I could think about was how I was running out of time." Emily swallowed hard. She had sensed he was going through something, but hearing it out loud made it feel even heavier. "That night, after you left, I sat on the couch just staring at the money in my hand. I felt like a failure, like I couldn't even provide for my own kid." He looked away, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. And then Noah came out of his room. Emily tilted her head. "He was awake." Mark nodded. "He must have heard us talking." He walked up to me and said, "Dad, we don't need money if we have nice people." A lump formed in Emily's throat. "That stuck with me." Mark went on. "I kept thinking about it, and then, the next morning, something crazy happened." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head like he still couldn't believe it himself. "I got a call from the same company that had just turned me down. The hiring manager said they had a last-minute opening and asked if I could come in immediately. I almost thought it was a mistake, but I didn't care. I just ran out the door." Emily's fingers curled around the edge of the table. And I got the job." His voice cracked slightly. "Not just any job, a stable one, full benefits, enough to finally get us back on our feet." Emily's breath caught. "Mark, that's amazing." He nodded, but there was more. She could feel it. "That's not all," he said, leaning in slightly. "After I got the job, I went to pick Noah up from daycare. And when I got there, one of the teachers pulled me aside. She said someone had anonymously paid off the last 3 months of tuition." Emily blinked. "Wait, what?" Mark's eyes met hers. "I know it was you." She felt her face flush. You don't have to admit it," he said quickly. "But I know, and I don't even know how to thank you. I was drowning, Emily, and you threw me a lifeline." A wave of emotion crashed over her. She hadn't expected anything in return, hadn't even thought much about it after she made the payment. She just knew that Noah deserved stability, and if there was something she could do to help, she would. Mark exhaled deeply, his hands tightening around his coffee cup again. "You changed everything for us, and that's why I had to see you. Because something like that, it's not just an act of kindness, it's something bigger." Emily looked down at the table, her throat tight. She had just done what she felt was right, but hearing how much of a difference it had made, it was overwhelming. "You don't owe me anything, Mark," she said softly. I just wanted to help. He nodded. I know. And that's exactly why I wanted to tell you this in person. Because people like you, they deserve to know how much they mean to others. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the coffee shop buzzed around them, murmured conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, the occasional clink of a spoon against porcelain. But between them, there was only quiet understanding. Finally, Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table toward her. "What's this?" she asked, hesitating before picking it up. "Just open it." She unfolded it slowly, and as her eyes scanned the words, her breath hitched. This wasn't just a thank you note. It was something much, much bigger. Emily's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the words. At first, they didn't fully register. She had been expecting maybe a handwritten thank you note or some kind of heartfelt message. But this was different. Her breath caught in her throat. "Mark," she whispered, looking up at him. "What is this?" He smiled, but there was something vulnerable in his expression, like he wasn't sure how she'd react. "It's a job offer," he said quietly. Emily's heart pounded. She looked back at the paper, reading it more carefully this time. It was a formal letter, an offer for a position at the very same company Mark had been hired at. "I mentioned you to my boss," he continued. "Told him about the kind of person you are, how you go out of your way for others, how you're responsible, patient, how you changed my life." He let out a soft chuckle. They were looking for someone like that, someone who cares. Emily's mind raced. She had been juggling babysitting jobs for years, struggling to find something more stable, but never quite getting the right opportunity. She had always loved working with kids, but this was something she hadn't expected. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark leaned forward. "Say yes." She looked up at him, searching his face. There was no pity, no sense that he was offering this out of obligation. He was genuinely excited for her, the same way she had been when she heard his good news. A warmth spread through her chest. She thought about how just a few weeks ago, they had both been struggling in different ways. Mark, trying to keep his head above water for his son, and her, trying to figure out where she belonged, what her next step should be. Now, here they were, lives intertwined in a way neither of them could have predicted. She exhaled slowly, a smile creeping onto her lips. "Okay," she said finally. "Yes." Mark grinned, relief washing over his face. "Good." For the first time in a long time, Emily felt something she hadn't realized she was missing. A sense of certainty, the kind that only comes when people help each other, when kindness comes full circle, when life has a way of giving back in unexpected ways. As she sat there, still holding the offer letter in her hands, she glanced out the window, watching as the world outside moved forward. And she knew, so was she,